The bullet meant for Clara Whitmore had already left the barrel by the time Elias Cade threw himself across her, and the crack of it, splitting the cold Montana air in 1882, was the last sound either of them registered clearly before the blood began. Clara had come to the mining town of Harrow Creek in the autumn of that year with nothing more than a battered leather satchel, a set of surgical instruments her late father had pressed into her hands on his deathbed, and a letter of introduction to the town's only general store owner, a stout man named Gideon Marsh, who had promised her steady work as a seamstress and occasional healer in exchange for a small room above his establishment. She had not expected to last the winter. She had not expected much of anything, truthfully, because Clara Whitmore was a woman who had learned to expect very little from the world and had found, to her quiet sorrow, that the world rarely chose to prove her wrong. Harrow Creek sat at the foot of the Beartooth Range in the southern reaches of Montana Territory, a rough collection of wooden storefronts and mud-packed roads that smelled perpetually of pine resin, livestock, and the particular sharp cold that came down off the mountains in October and never quite left until late April. The town had sprung up around a silver strike 3 years prior, and had since gathered to itself the usual congregation of fortune-seekers, drifters, gamblers, and the few steady families who sold them food, liquor, faith, or medical care at considerable markup. There was a sheriff, a man named Orrin Dulles, who was competent enough to keep the worst of the violence contained to the saloons, and a circuit preacher who came through every 6 weeks smelling of whiskey and conviction in equal measure. Clara settled in quickly enough. She had a practical mind and steady hands, and Gideon Marsh discovered within the first week that she could mend a coat with invisible stitches and diagnose a chest infection with the calm authority of someone twice her 24 years. She kept her dark hair pinned tight beneath a wool bonnet in the mornings and let it fall loose when she thought no one was looking, which was more often than she realized, because in a town like Harrow Creek, everyone was always looking at something. She had been in town exactly 3 weeks and 2 days when she first saw Elias Cade. He came down from the high country on a gray horse that moved with the careful deliberateness of an animal that understood bad weather and difficult terrain, which were the only 2 things Harrow Creek had in reliable supply. Clara was standing on the porch of Marsh's general store with a bolt of red calico under one arm and a list of thread colors in her hand when the horse and its rider appeared at the far end of the main road, and she felt, before she thought, the particular quality of stillness that came off him like heat from a banked fire. Elias Cade was a large man. That was the first and most immediate fact about him. He stood several inches past 6 feet when he dismounted, and the breadth of his shoulders beneath his worn canvas jacket was the breadth of a man who had spent years doing work that the mountains demanded rather than the kind of work that towns provided. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar in uneven waves as though cutting it had never been high enough on his list of priorities to warrant the trouble, and his jaw was covered in several days of dark stubble that suited the rest of him the way rough bark suited an old pine. His hands, when he looped his reins around the hitching post, were large and scarred and moved with a careful efficiency that suggested they were accustomed to managing things of considerable weight. He did not look at Clara. He went directly into the saloon across the road. She went directly back inside Marsh's store, set the calico on the counter with perhaps slightly more force than necessary, and told herself she had not been staring. Gideon Marsh, who had been watching from behind a barrel of dried beans, permitted himself a small smile that he was wise enough not to let her see. Elias Cade, as Marsh explained to her later that evening over supper with the careful neutrality of a man sharing information and nothing more, was what the territory called a mountain man, though that term had become something of a romantic exaggeration for what was in practical fact an extraordinarily capable trapper, guide, and occasional problem solver for the mining operations that required someone who knew the high passes well enough to navigate them in deteriorating weather. He had a cabin somewhere up in the Beartooth Range that he retreated to for months at a stretch, and he came down to Harrow Creek perhaps 4 or 5 times a year to trade his furs, replenish his supplies, and conduct whatever other business required the presence of civilization, which he appeared to consider a necessary inconvenience rather than a genuine pleasure. He was, Marsh added carefully, cutting his venison into precise squares, a man who kept largely to himself. His age, Marsh estimated, was somewhere around 30, though the mountains had a way of making a man's age difficult to determine with any precision. He had no family that anyone in Harrow Creek knew of, and no particular vices beyond a preference for sitting alone at the bar rather than at a table with others. Clara thanked Marsh for the information in a tone that suggested she had not particularly needed it, and went upstairs to her small room where she sat at the window for a long time, watching the lamplight in the saloon across the road and telling herself she was doing nothing of the kind. She encountered Elias Cade properly for the first time 2 days later on a cold Thursday afternoon when the sky had gone the color of old pewter and the first serious snow of the season was making its intentions felt in the sharp bite of the air. She was coming out of the assayer's office where she had delivered a letter for Marsh, and he was coming up the steps of the same building at the same moment, and they met at the threshold in the particular awkward collision of two people who have each assumed the doorway was theirs alone. She stepped back. He stepped back. They looked at each other. Up close, he was more imposing than she had appreciated from across the road. The jacket he wore was open at the collar despite the cold, and beneath it she could see the substantial architecture of a chest and shoulders that belonged to a man who routinely carried things that would have broken a different kind of person. His eyes were a clear, direct gray, the color of the sky right before snow, and they looked at her with an attention that was frank without being rude, the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. "Miss," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular carrying quality of a voice accustomed to being used in open spaces. "I am sorry," she said. "I was not watching the steps." "Neither was I," he said, and stepped aside to let her pass. She passed. She did not look back. Behind her she heard the door of the assayer's office open and close, and then she was walking back up the road toward Marsh's store with her heart doing something entirely unreasonable inside her chest, and her cheeks warm in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Over the following 2 weeks she saw him 3 more times. Once at the general store, where he stood at the counter for a long, quiet conversation with Marsh about the condition of the northern passes, while Clara pretended to organize bolts of fabric in the far corner and heard every word. Once at the edge of the road while she was crossing to the apothecary, and he was saddling his horse outside the smithy, and he had nodded to her with a brief gravity that she had returned in kind. And once in the evening, when she had stepped out onto the back porch of the store to watch the stars come out over the mountains, and found him standing in the alley below, smoking a pipe with his back against the building, looking at the same mountains she was looking at. He had glanced up. She had not moved. The silence between them had lasted perhaps 30 seconds, and had been, she thought afterward, both entirely comfortable and entirely electric, which seemed like a contradiction and yet was not. "They are something in this light," she said, meaning the mountains. "They are something in any light," he said, meaning, she thought, the same thing she did. After that she began looking forward to the particular quality of silence that Elias Cade brought into whatever space he occupied, which was alarming to her in a way she could not quite articulate and did not particularly want to. The trouble arrived in Harrow Creek on a Tuesday in late November, riding in on 3 horses with bad intentions and worse reputations in the form of Deke Harlan and his 2 associates, a pair of contracted killers who went by the names of Sutton and Crew, and who had ridden up from Wyoming following a robbery gone wrong and a disagreement with the territorial marshal that had left a deputy dead and a warrant with their names on it growing colder by the mile. Harlan was the kind of man who made a room go quiet when he entered it, not from any physical impressiveness, but from the particular quality of his gaze, which was flat and calculating in the manner of an animal that has learned to take what it needs without asking. He was lean and weathered and had the practiced ease of someone who had been dangerous for so long it had stopped requiring effort. He wore 2 pistols on his belt and moved as though he expected to use both of them before the day was out. Sheriff Dulles recognized the situation for what it was the moment the 3 men dismounted at the saloon, and he sent word to the single deputy he employed, a young man named Tate, who was more willing than experienced, that they were to watch Harlan's party closely and not give them any reason to escalate. Dulles's strategy, born of long experience with dangerous men passing through small towns, was to let them drink, let them sleep, and let them leave. It was not a heroic strategy, but it had the advantage of keeping the townspeople alive, which Dulles considered his primary professional obligation. What Dulles had not accounted for, and what no one in Harrow Creek had any way of knowing, was that Deke Harlan had a specific reason for choosing Harrow Creek that had nothing to do with its relative anonymity or its convenient position near the northern passes. His reason was named Thomas Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore, Clara's uncle by marriage, was a man who had made and lost several fortunes in the mining territories, and whose most recent endeavor, a silver claim in the Beartooth foothills that had been registered with the territorial government in Helena, was the subject of a fraudulent deed transfer that had taken several $1,000s from Harlan's pocket 6 months prior, and left Harlan with the particular slow fury of a man who feels he's been made a fool of. Whitmore had wisely departed the territory before Harlan could respond, but not before sending word to his niece in the form of a letter that contained, sewn into its lining with the kind of careful concealment that suggested Thomas Whitmore had known this day might come, a copy of the original deed that would render Harlan's claim legally void. Clara had not known what the letter contained. She had received it 2 weeks after arriving in Harrow Creek, had noted the oddness of the lining, but assumed it was her uncle's particular brand of theatrical secrecy, and had set it on the shelf above her bed between her Bible and her father's medical book, without opening the inner lining at all. It was Harlan's associate Sutton who found this out, in the quiet and unpleasant way that men like Sutton found things out, by asking questions in the saloon with money on the table, and getting answers from a man who had been drinking Marsh's credit dry for a week, and saw the coin as a fine solution to his immediate problem. The information Sutton returned with was that the Whitmore woman was residing above Marsh's general store, and that she had received a letter from her uncle some weeks past, and that Harlan would very much like to speak with her about the contents of that letter before anyone else had occasion to. Harlan's idea of speaking with someone was not the kind Clara would have recognized as conversation. The night it happened was the kind of cold that meant business, the temperature having dropped sharply after a brief afternoon thaw, in the way that Montana nights in late November had of teaching you humility whether you were interested in the lesson or not. Clara had come downstairs to refill the small pot of coals she kept in her room for warmth, and had found Marsh asleep over his ledger at the front counter, and had taken the coal bucket out the back door to the bin in the alley behind the store, rather than wake him. She was filling the bucket when she heard the footsteps, and she registered before she turned around that there were 2 sets of them, not one, and that they were not the footsteps of people going about legitimate nighttime business. Sutton and crew had come around the back of the building in the dark, and when Clara turned and saw them in the light from the back window, her first instinct was not to scream, but to remain perfectly still, which was the instinct of a person who has learned that sudden movements in uncertain situations tend to make things considerably worse. "Miss Whitmore," Sutton said, in the conversational tone of someone who would very much prefer not to have to be unpleasant, but is entirely prepared to be so. "We would like to talk to you about a letter." "I do not know what letter you mean," Clara said. "I think you do," Sutton said, and took a step toward her. What happened next came from the far end of the alley with the speed and the decisiveness of something that had been watching the situation develop and had decided on a course of action some time before it executed it. Elias Cade had been in the alley because he had come to the general store to speak with Marsh about the possibility of wintering a second horse in Marsh's stable, and finding the front door locked had come around the back to check if the light was still on, a route that took him through the alley at precisely the moment that Sutton and crew had a woman with a coal bucket pinned between them and a wall. He took in the situation in a single sweep of his gray eyes and said nothing at all for a very long moment. Then he said, in the particular quiet voice of a man who does not need volume to make himself entirely clear, "Walk away." Crew, who was the smarter of the two, looked at Elias Cade standing at the end of the alley in the lamplight, considered the breadth of those shoulders and the absolute absence of fear in that face, and put his hand on Sutton's arm with a slight pressure that meant, "Let us think carefully here." Sutton was not the smarter of the two. Sutton went for his pistol. What followed happened very quickly, and in the way that violence has of compressing time into a sequence of sharp images rather than a continuous narrative. Sutton's hand cleared his holster. Clara, who had moved instinctively toward the building when the gun appeared, found Elias Cade suddenly between her and the barrel as the shot went off, and felt rather than heard the impact of what happened next, a sound like something thick and fast hitting solid muscle. And then Elias Cade was still upright, but he had one hand braced against the alley wall, and his expression had gone from calm to the particular concentrated stillness of a man managing a very large amount of pain very deliberately. The sound of the shot brought Sheriff Dulles and Deputy Tate at a run, because Dulles had been sleeping in his office with one ear open, as was his custom when dangerous men were in town, and the two of them appeared at the mouth of the alley in time to see Crew throw his hands up without being asked, Sutton backing slowly against the wall with his pistol pointed at nothing, and Elias Cade standing between Clara Whitmore and both of them with blood beginning to darken the left side of his jacket. Dulles read the situation with the speed of long experience. Sutton and Crew were disarmed and taken to the jail in a matter of minutes. Tate went for Harlan, who was still in the saloon, and who, when informed that his associates were in custody and that the game was decisively over, chose practical survival over dramatic stands and submitted to arrest with the tight-lipped composure of a man adjusting his long-term plans. Clara did none of that. Clara was beside Elias Cade with her hands on his arm the moment Dulles stepped between them and the guns, and what she felt when her fingers found the spreading wet warmth of the wound made her stomach drop in the particular way it did when a situation was serious and getting more serious. "You need to come inside," she said. "Right now. Can you walk?" He looked at her. His jaw was set and his eyes were clear, and he was breathing with the shallow, careful precision of someone who has taken an injury and is choosing, with considerable force of will, not to be governed by it. "I can walk," he said. He walked. She kept her hand on his arm, and he let her, which she understood was not something Elias Cade did easily or often, and they went through the back door of the store and into the light. Gideon Marsh, who had woken at the sound of the shot and come to the back room in his nightshirt with a rifle he would not have been able to use effectively even if the situation had required it, took one look at the scene before him, set the rifle against the wall, and went to put water on the stove without being asked, because Gideon Marsh was a man who knew what useful looked like and was wise enough to become it immediately. Clara cleared the workbench in the back room with one sweep of her arm, sending bolts of fabric and spools of thread cascading to the floor, and turned to find Elias Cade looking at the bench with the particular expression of a large man confronting a piece of furniture that is quite clearly not built to his scale. "Sit," she said, in the tone she used when she was working, which was a tone that did not particularly invite negotiation. He sat. He did not wince when he did it, which told her something about his pain tolerance that was both reassuring and concerning. She helped him out of his jacket and then his shirt, and the sight of the wound made her draw a breath through her teeth and reach immediately for the satchel she had gone back upstairs to fetch in the 30 seconds Marsh had given her before following Elias to the bench. The bullet had gone into the left side of his chest below the shoulder, missing the heart and the lung by margins that, in the lamplight with her fingers probing the entry point, felt like the kind of margins that only fools take for granted. It had not, by the grace of whatever providence watched over stubborn mountain men who threw themselves in front of bullets, gone deep enough to reach anything immediately vital, but it was in muscle, and it was bleeding with a seriousness that required attention. She could provide, and needed to provide quickly. She had her father's surgical instruments in the satchel. She had the training he had given her over years of watching and practicing and asking questions that had driven lesser tutors to distraction. She had steady hands and a clear head when the work required it. She also, she discovered as she laid out her instruments in the lamplight and looked at the wound, and then at the man sitting before her with his shirt gone and his extraordinary chest laid bare and his gray eyes watching her face with the careful attention of someone who is trusting another person with something important, had tears running down her face that she had not given permission to be there. She wiped them with the back of her wrist and did not stop working. "This is going to hurt," she told him. "I expect it will," he said. She worked. She cleaned the wound with whiskey from the bottle Marsh produced at her request and probed for the bullet with the particular delicate ruthlessness of good surgical practice, and Elias Cade sat perfectly still through all of it with his jaw locked and his hands flat on his thighs, and his breathing controlled and even in the manner of a man who has decided to give this woman exactly what she needs to do her job and not make it harder. He made no sound when she located the bullet. He made no sound when she removed it. He made one short, sharp sound, involuntary and immediately suppressed, when she began to close the wound, and the sound went through Clara's chest like a wire drawn tight. She stitched him with the same invisible precision she gave to the finest fabric in Marsh's stock, because this was more important than any fabric had ever been, and her hands knew it, even when her mind was working too hard to acknowledge it. She had to stop twice to wipe her eyes, not because the tears blurred her vision, but because they fell, and she did not want them falling on him, and each time she stopped, she told herself the next time she would be better controlled, and each time she was not. Elias Cade watched her weep with quiet attention. He did not comment on it. He did not ask her to stop. He looked at her face in the lamplight with those gray eyes, and something moved through them that was neither pity nor discomfort, but something else entirely, something older and more careful than either of those things. When she was done and had bandaged the wound with clean linen from her satchel, she sat back on the stool she had pulled up beside the bench and put her face in her hands and let the shaking come, because it had been waiting politely since the alley, and she could no longer ask it to wait. Gideon Marsh, with the considerable wisdom of a man who understood when a room needed him elsewhere, took his lantern and went upstairs, murmuring something about blankets that neither of them particularly heard. After a moment, she felt the weight of a large, warm hand settle very carefully on the top of her head, which was the last thing she had expected, and which undid whatever remained of her composure entirely. "You are the one who was nearly shot," she said, her voice muffled behind her hands. "I'm behaving very foolishly." "You took a bullet out of a man in a back room by lamplight," he said, his voice very close and very quiet. "You are allowed whatever comes after." She lowered her hands and looked at him. He was looking back at her with an expression that had no agenda in it, no performance, no calculation. It was simply the expression of a man who was where he was and was not pretending otherwise. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "You did not know me." "I knew enough," he said. She did not know what to say to that. She was not certain there was anything to say to that, so she looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she stood and began cleaning her instruments, and the silence between them was the same silence she had noticed on the back porch with the stars and the mountains, and it felt as natural as anything she had encountered in Harrow Creek. The next morning, with the weather having made good on its threats and deposited 4 inches of snow overnight, she went to the room above the smithy, where Elias Cade had been persuaded to sleep rather than attempt the ride back up the mountain with a fresh bullet wound in his chest. She told herself she was there to check the dressing. She was there to check the dressing. He was sitting up when she arrived, which was either a testament to his recovery rate or his stubborn refusal to perform the role of patient with any authenticity. He had put on a fresh shirt from the saddlebag Marsh had brought in from his horse, though the act of doing so had evidently cost him something, because there was a tightness around his eyes when he moved his left arm that told Clara more than any complaint would have. "You should not have done that by yourself," she said, meaning the shirt. "I have been dressing myself for some years," he said. "You have not usually done it with a bullet wound in your chest," she said. This, somewhat to her surprise, produced a brief movement at the corner of his mouth that might, under more generous circumstances, have been called a smile. It transformed his face in a way that was so unexpectedly affecting that she had to look down at her medical bag for a moment before she trusted herself to look back at him. She changed the dressing. The wound was clean and showed no signs of inflammation, which was the best possible outcome at this stage, and reflected more on his underlying health than her medical skill, though she would admit neither of these things to him. He bore the process with the same still patience as the night before, and she worked with the same care, and the silence was comfortable and dense between them. "What is your name?" he asked while she was rewrapping the bandage. She paused. "Clara Whitmore. You know my name." "I know what I heard in the alley," he said. "I wanted to hear you say it." The heat that moved up her neck was something she attributed firmly to the warmth of the room and absolutely nothing else. "Clara," she said, "and you are Elias Cade." "I am," he said. "Mr. Cade," she said. Elias, he said, in the tone of a man making a small but firm correction. She tied off the bandage. Elias, she said. He stayed in Harrow Creek longer than either of them had expected, which was not entirely a consequence of his injury, though his injury provided a reasonable justification. The snow that had fallen overnight was followed by 3 more days of the same, and the passes north of town became impassable with a certainty that even a man who knew the mountains as well as Elias Cade could not argue with, which left him with a room above the smithy and time on his hands, and very little to do with either, except gradually make his way into the daily rhythms of a town that was learning, cautiously, to accommodate his presence. Clara checked his dressing every morning, and sometimes in the evenings too, when she told herself the light was better then, and she wanted to be thorough, and Elias Cade accepted these visits with a gravity that gave away nothing, and, she eventually realized, a punctuality that suggested he was not finding them unwelcome. They began to talk, not immediately and not about anything of consequence at first, but in the way that two people who have already said something important to each other through action and silence and proximity find that words eventually become necessary simply because there is more to say than any of those other methods can carry. He told her about the Beartooth Range in winter, about the quality of the silence at high elevation when the snow was falling, and there was nothing between you and the sky but cold and pine and whatever thoughts you had brought up with you. She told him about her father's practice in Missouri, about learning to stitch skin before she was 12 because there was no one else to learn from, about the particular peculiar grief of watching someone who knows everything die of the one thing he could not fix in himself. She told him about her uncle's letter, which she had retrieved from her room and examined properly after the night of the shooting, spreading the lining carefully with her small scissors and finding the deed copy folded to translucency inside it. She had given the document to Sheriff Dulles the morning after, and Dulles had held it with the careful reverence of a man who understood that a piece of paper this small could resolve a situation this large, and had dispatched Tate to Helena with it before the morning was half over. Harlan and Sutton and crew were in the Harrow Creek jail awaiting the circuit judge, who would not arrive for another 3 weeks because the circuit judge operated on a schedule that acknowledged the realities of Montana winter travel while remaining philosophically committed to the concept of justice. They were not comfortable, but they were contained, and Clara found that the knowledge of their confinement made the difference between waking in the night with her heart pounding and sleeping through to morning with reasonable success. One evening in the first week of December, Clara brought supper from Marsh's kitchen to the smithy room, because Elias Cade's mobility was still limited enough that the walk to the hotel dining room where he had been taking his meals was more than the wound should reasonably be asked to accommodate, and because Marsh had made a beef stew that was excellent, and she felt it would be a pity to let excellent stew travel a whole block without supervision. She found him at the small table by the window with a piece of paper and a pencil, drawing what turned out, when she set the stew down and looked, to be a remarkably detailed rendering of the mountain view from the window, all line and shadow and careful attention to the way the pine shapes sat against the sky. "I did not know you drew," she said. "There's a great deal of time in the mountains," he said. "A man finds occupations." She sat across from him, and they ate the stew, and the conversation moved between the comfortable and the revelatory, with the ease that had begun to characterize the time they spent together. And at some point, she realized that the light in the room had shifted from evening gold to deep lamplight, and that she had been there for 2 hours, and that neither of them had looked toward the door. She told him, because the stew was good and the lamplight was warm, and he was watching her with those gray eyes that always seemed to be paying a particular kind of attention, about why she had come to Harrow Creek, about the fiancé in Missouri who had, upon her father's death and the revelation that the medical practice came with more debt than assets, discovered a prior commitment that had conveniently prevented their marriage, about the particular quality of loneliness that came from watching a life you had planned disappear not through catastrophe, but through the quiet, practical calculations of someone who had decided you were not worth the complication. She had not meant to say so much. She said it anyway, because Elias Cade had the quality of a good listener, which was less about what he said and more about the way he received what was given him, with a stillness and a genuine attention that made the words feel safer than she was accustomed to them being. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The man was a fool," in a tone so direct and so utterly without qualification that she laughed, which surprised her considerably more than it seemed to surprise him. "You do not know enough to say that," she said. "I know what I have seen," he said. "That is enough." She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her. Outside, the wind moved through the pines at the edge of town, and the snow on the windowsill caught the lamplight and glittered, and Clara Whitmore thought, with a clarity that was equal parts frightening and inevitable, that she was in some amount of serious trouble. She went home that night and sat at her window for a long time, looking at the lamplight in the smithy room window. The circuit judge arrived on the 18th of December, having made better time than expected, apparently driven by the combined forces of civic duty and the prospect of Marsh's cooking, which had a reputation that extended throughout the circuit. He tried Harlan, Sutton, and Crew over 2 days with the focused efficiency of a man who had reviewed the evidence on the road and arrived with his conclusions largely formed. Sutton's shot at Elias Cade was a matter of eyewitness testimony from both Clara and Marsh, who had woken fully in time to see the aftermath from the back doorway. Harlan's conspiracy and the underlying fraud were documented in the deed copy that had been retrieved from the letter lining. The territorial marshal had sent a deputy up from Helena for the occasion, and the deputy had brought with him a stack of prior warrants and affidavits that made the proceedings more thorough than was usually possible in a jurisdiction of Harrow Creek size. Harlan received 7 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. Sutton received 5. Crew, who had thrown up his hands immediately and cooperated with Dulles from the beginning, received 18 months and a strongly worded letter of guidance from the judge about the company a man chose to keep. Clara attended the sentencing and stood in the back of the makeshift courthouse with her hands folded and her expression composed. And when the gavel came down, she did not feel triumphant, only tired and faintly relieved in the way that the end of a prolonged uncertainty always felt, regardless of whether the outcome was good. Elias was beside her. He had come to stand there without being asked, sometime between the opening of the proceedings and the rendering of the verdict, materializing at her shoulder with the particular quiet capability that seemed to characterize everything he did. And she had been so glad of his presence that she had not trusted herself to acknowledge it directly. When they walked out into the cold afternoon, she said, "Thank you for coming." "I was not going to let you hear that alone," he said simply, as though this were the only reasonable position on the matter. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The street was busy with the usual afternoon traffic of a mining town, horses and wagons and men in heavy coats moving purposefully through the cold, and in the middle of it they stood still for a moment and looked at each other. "Your wound," she said. "I should check the dressing before you go back up." "The wound is healing well," he said. "I am the one with medical training," she said. "I will determine that." Another small movement at the corner of his mouth. "All right, Miss Whitmore." "Clara," she said, in the tone of a woman making a small but firm correction. The corner of his mouth moved again. "Clara," he said. She changed the dressing that evening in the warm back room of Marsh's store while the snow came down outside, and Marsh sat conspicuously in the front of the store, making a great deal of unnecessary noise with the inventory. The wound was healing beautifully, as she had known it would, because his constitution was remarkable, and because she had done the work with the kind of care she gave to things that mattered, and she told him so with a professional detachment that she felt was entirely convincing. She was cutting the bandage with small scissors, her face close to the work, when he said her name. She looked up. He was looking at her in the lamplight with an expression she had not seen on his face before, or rather with an expression that she had seen building on his face for 3 weeks, and was now there in full, undisguised and direct and unmistakable. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I will be going back up to the cabin after the New Year," he said, "when the pass is open. I expect I will be there through March, maybe April." He paused. "I would like to come back down in the spring, properly, to call on you if you are willing." Clara set down the scissors. She looked at him for a long moment in the warm lamplight. "I will be here," she said. He held her gaze with those clear gray eyes, and something settled in his expression, something that had been held at tension, released to rest, the way a rope goes slack when it is finally tied to the thing it has been reaching for. "Good," he said. She finished the bandage. He stayed for another hour in the warm back room, and they talked about books she had brought from Missouri and the way the stars looked from 8,000 feet in January, and whether it was possible to make a decent apple pie with dried fruit. And when he finally went back to the smithy room, she stood at the back door and watched the snow fall and felt something she had nearly forgotten she was capable of feeling, which was the particular warm weight of anticipation. He left for the mountains on the 3rd of January, 1883, on a clear, cold morning after the passes had opened and the weather had given him a reasonable window. Clara was at the door of the general store when he rode by, ostensibly because she was hanging the morning's new delivery notice, which was a task that could have been accomplished from inside, and both of them knew it. He reined in the gray horse. "I will see you in the spring," he said. "You will," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes. "Take care of yourself, Clara. And you, Elias." He rode. She watched until the gray horse and the broad shoulders of the man on it disappeared around the bend at the north end of town, and then she went inside and stood at the front window for another moment before she turned back to the work that was waiting, which was considerable and which she attacked with somewhat more energy than usual, because energy was what she had, and she needed somewhere to put it. Winter in Harrow Creek without Elias Cade was exactly as long as she had expected it to be, which was longer than any winter had a right to be, and she filled it with work and more work and the careful management of her growing medical practice, because word had spread through the territory that there was a woman in Harrow Creek who could take a bullet out of a man without killing him in the process, and this turned out to be an enormously marketable skill in a mining town in 1883. She set broken fingers and treated chest infections and delivered, on a brutally cold night in February, a miner's wife of twins who arrived 6 weeks early and small as sparrows, and who nonetheless, by a combination of Clara's careful nursing and the fierce determination of their mother, made it through the winter and were still alive and loudly opinionated by the time March arrived. She received one letter from Elias in February, delivered by a trapper who came down through Harrow Creek on his way south and who handed the folded paper to Clara at Marsh's counter with the careful gravity of someone who understood that he was carrying something important. The letter was written in a hand that was larger than she had expected and less uncertain, direct sentences in a plain vocabulary that managed somehow to carry more warmth than more elaborate prose would have. He told her about the high country in winter, about a cougar he had heard 3 nights running outside the cabin without seeing, about the particular quality of silence at dawn when the snow was new. He did not say that he was thinking about her, but he had written her a letter in February across a mountain winter, and she understood, holding the paper in the cold back room of Marsh's store, that this was the same thing. She wrote back the same day, 2 pages in her small, precise hand about the twin boys and the miner's broken collarbone, and the way the snow looked on the mountains when the afternoon light came sideways across it from the south, and gave the letter to Marsh to hold for the next traveler going north, which turned out to be a surveying party heading for the Upper Beartooth in mid-March. She was fairly certain the letter reached him. She was less certain what she was doing, except that she was doing it with her whole attention, and that felt like enough for now. Spring came to the Beartooth Range in the way that spring came to everything at high elevation, which was haltingly and with considerable backsliding, the snow retreating up the slopes and then returning for a final argument before giving way to the mud and the runoff and the first impossible green of the lower meadows. Clara watched the mountains from her window and from the porch of the store and from the apothecary door, where she now also kept an examination room 2 days a week by arrangement, and she did not precisely count the days, but she was aware of their passage with an attention she did not apply to other things. Elias Cade rode back into Harrow Creek on the 14th of April, on a morning that smelled of pine and snowmelt and the particular fresh cold of a mountain spring day, and Clara was at the counter of Marsh's store, helping a miner's wife choose calico for curtains, when she heard the gray horse outside and looked up and through the window and felt something shift in her chest, like the first breath after a long time underwater. She excused herself from the calico conversation with a murmured promise to return shortly and went to the door, and Elias was already dismounting and looping his reins around the post. And when he turned and saw her standing in the doorway, his face did the thing it did when something that had been intention released to rest, and she thought she probably looked the same. He came up the steps. He was the same, and more so, the winter in the high country having done nothing to diminish the considerable physical fact of him, the dark hair longer now past his collar, and the jaw heavy with new beard, and the shoulders and chest beneath the open jacket, exactly as she had stitched them, and exactly as she had thought about stitching them through the long months of the winter. "You are here," he said. "I told you I would be," she said. He stood before her on the porch and looked at her with those gray eyes and said very quietly, "You look well, Clara." "You look well too, Elias," she said, "except that you need to let me look at that wound." He did. It had healed perfectly, which she had expected, and which he endured her examination of with the patience of a man who is perfectly aware that the examination is partly professional and partly an excuse to be in the same room together again, and who does not mind this at all. He took her to dinner that evening at the hotel, which was the closest Harrow Creek came to a formal establishment, and the proprietor gave them the table by the window and brought them the best of what the kitchen had, which was good beef and fried potatoes and the first green onions of the season, and they talked for 3 hours, and the time moved the way it always did when they were together, which was to say that it moved too fast, and with the particular quality of something that feels exactly right. He came to call 3 more evenings that week and twice the next, and on the 3rd week of April he took her riding up into the foothills on the gray horse, with Clara on a smaller roan that Marsh had available for loan, and showed her the lower meadows where the snow had given way to the first spring growth, and the sound of the creek was enormous with the runoff, and the sky was so blue above the dark pines that it hurt to look at it. They dismounted at a rocky outcropping above a small fall of water and sat with their backs against the warm stone and the horses grazing below them, and the mountains spread out in every direction. And Elias told her about the cabin up in the high country, and she told him about the twins who were now fat and vigorous and the pride of their father. And at some point in the afternoon, her hand found his on the rock between them, or his found hers. And they sat like that for a long time, looking at the mountains and not saying anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already being said. He asked her one evening in early May, sitting on the back porch of the store in the warm spring evening with the sound of the creek audible from 2 streets over and the stars coming out bright above the mountains, whether she had always wanted to be a healer or whether it had simply been what the circumstances required. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think. "Both," she said. "I wanted it, and the circumstances required it, and I do not know now where one ends and the other begins." "That is how good things work," he said. "The wanting and the needing become the same thing." She looked at him in the evening light. He was looking at the mountains, his profile quiet and strong against the darkening sky. And she thought about what it would mean to be loved by a man who faced the world this way, with this particular quality of steady directness that had no performance in it, no pretense, just the clear and unambiguous commitment of a person who did not know how to be otherwise. "Elias," she said. He turned to look at her. "I think I am falling in love with you," she said, because Clara Whitmore had learned through the long particular education of her life that the truth said clearly was nearly always better than the truth said obliquely, even when the truth was frightening. He looked at her for a long, unhurried moment. "I know," he said. And then, before she could decide whether that was presumptuous or simply accurate, he added, "I fell in love with you somewhere between the alley and the back room, and I have not found my way out since, and I stopped trying sometime in February." She looked at him. He looked at her. The stars were coming out over the Beartooth Range, and the evening was warm, and the sound of the creek carried up through the town in the spring dark. She leaned forward and kissed him, which was what she had wanted to do since the day on the rocky outcropping above the falls, or possibly since the day on the back porch with the stars and the mountains, or possibly since the morning she had stood in the doorway watching him ride toward the mountains in January, and felt the particular ache of understanding that she would have to wait for spring. He kissed her back with the same care and attention he brought to everything, which was to say completely and without reservation, one large hand coming up to cup the side of her face with a gentleness that was startling in something so large. And when they drew back, the night air was sweet with pine and new grass, and Clara Whitmore was laughing, quietly and for no reason she could have articulated, except that she was happy, which was reason enough. He asked her to marry him on the 22nd of May, which was a Sunday, which she had not planned, and he might or might not have, sitting on the bench outside the church after the circuit preacher's morning service, with the whole town flowing around them and paying no attention because the town had been watching this coming for months and had largely decided it was settled. He asked with the same plain directness he brought to everything, looking at her in the morning light with those gray eyes and saying that he loved her and wanted her to be his wife, and that he understood if she needed time but that he was not capable of wanting anything else, and she might as well know it. She said yes without requiring any time at all. Gideon Marsh, who had been watching from the church steps with a cup of coffee he had produced from somewhere improbable, said something that sounded very much like "finally," in a tone of moderate exasperation, which Clara decided to attribute to the general excitement of the occasion, and not to any implication that she had taken longer than necessary to reach this particular conclusion. They were married in June, on a Saturday when the mountains showed the last of their snowcaps above the green lower slopes, and the meadows below town were full of the particular wildflowers that appeared only in that brief window between the snowmelt and the summer heat. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony in the church, with Gideon Marsh standing up for Elias and the miner's wife, whose twins Clara had delivered, standing up for Clara, and the whole town in attendance, because in a town of Harrow Creek size, a wedding was an event that required no invitation, and everyone understood this. Clara wore a dress she had made herself from ivory wool challis, fitted close through the bodice and falling in simple clean lines, with small buttons she had been saving for something worthy from the stock at Marsh's store. Her hair was down, all of it, falling past her shoulders in dark waves that she had brushed smooth but left loose, because she had decided that this was what she wanted it to look like on the day she married Elias Cade. Elias wore a dark coat that Marsh had helped him procure from the dry goods merchant in the next town over, because Harrow Creek's clothing options for a man of his proportions were limited, and beneath it a white shirt that he wore with the collar open because he was Elias Cade and old habits were old habits. His hair was freshly washed and fell clean past his collar, and he had trimmed his beard, not off, but to a careful short length that suited his face in the particular way that some things suit a person, because they have grown into them together. He looked at her when she came down the church aisle on Gideon Marsh's arm, with an expression that she did not think she would ever fully be able to describe, and did not need to, because it was the expression of a man who has everything in front of him that he intends to spend the rest of his life taking care of, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She said her vows in a clear, steady voice, looking at him the whole time. He said his, in that low, unhurried voice that she had come to understand, was the voice he used when something mattered, which was to say with absolute and complete conviction, and not a single word wasted. And when the preacher finished, and Elias kissed her, the whole church made a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a sigh, and was both. They spent the first weeks of their marriage in the room above Marsh's store, while Elias built onto the cabin in the high country, which was what he had wanted to do since February, and which he now did with the focused efficiency of a man who has a good reason for every board he nails and every window he frames. He came down to Harrow Creek on Fridays and went back up on Sundays, and Clara used the intervening weeks to settle the affairs of her practice, which had grown enough by now that she needed to arrange for someone to cover the routine cases during the periods she would be at the cabin. The arrangement they arrived at was characteristically practical and entirely their own. Clara would maintain her healing practice in Harrow Creek through the winter months when the cabin was isolated and the passes uncertain, and in the spring and summer and early fall she would divide her time between the cabin and the town, riding up with Elias when the weather allowed and coming down as the cases required. They were, Marsh observed with satisfaction, two people who had figured out how to be together without diminishing either of the things that made them what they were, which was the best possible definition of a successful marriage, and also, in his experience, the rarest. The cabin in the high country, as Clara discovered when she first rode up with Elias in the clear, cool days of early September, was larger than she had imagined and better built than almost anything she had seen in the valley below. It sat at the edge of a high meadow, with the main peaks rising behind it, and a view to the south and east that on a clear day extended to a horizon that looked like the edge of the world. Elias had added a proper second room, large enough for a real bed and a good chest and the small bookcase Clara brought up in a saddlebag, and a covered porch that faced the mountains and caught the afternoon sun. She stood on that porch the first evening and looked at the mountains in the last light, with the sky going gold and then rose and then the particular deep blue that came just before the stars, and she felt Elias come up behind her and put his arms around her, which he did with the careful certainty of a man who is entirely sure of his welcome, and she leaned back into him and felt the solid warmth of his chest and the contained strength of his arms in thought, with a wonder that was not diminishing with familiarity, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Well," he said, meaning the mountains and the meadow and the cabin and all of it. "Well," she said, meaning the same things and more, "it is quite extraordinary." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "It is better now," he said. That winter they came down to Harrow Creek in early November and stayed through March, and Clara worked and Elias helped Dulles with a cattle dispute that required someone who knew the high country boundaries well enough to settle the argument with authority. And they lived in the rooms above Marsh's store that Marsh had insisted they take over in full when he moved into the house behind the store he had been meaning to improve since long before Clara arrived. In February, Clara told Elias that she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast on a cold morning with the stove lit and the coffee made, because she was not a woman who dealt in theatrical moments when a plain one would serve. She said it directly, looking at him across the small table, and watched what happened to his face. What happened to his face was something she had not seen before and had not known to expect, which was the complete and total dissolution of every quality of reserve and careful management that his face usually carried, replaced by something so open and so immediate that she had to blink and look again to be certain it was still the same man sitting across from her, which it was, except that he was also something more. He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, which was by some distance the most immediately emotional thing she had ever seen Elias Cade do. And he held it and looked at her and said, "Clara," in a voice that was not quite steady. "It will be October, I think," she said, with the clinical precision she deployed whenever she was trying not to cry, which was immediately betrayed by the fact that she was obviously about to cry. He came around the table, which he did not do smoothly because the table was small and he was not, and then he was crouching beside her chair with her hand still in both of his and his face level with hers, and she abandoned the clinical precision and cried properly, which she had discovered she was allowed to do when Elias Cade was present. "Are you well?" he asked, immediately and with the focused attention of a man who is already considering what he needs to do. "I am perfectly well," she said, laughing through the tears. "You're going to build another room." "I'm going to build another room," he agreed, very seriously, and then he pulled her carefully forward and held her against his chest in the warm kitchen with the snow falling outside, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, the heart that the bullet had missed by 3 inches and that had been beating for her ever since. He built the room. He built it onto the Harrow Creek house through the spring, adding a proper nursery off the main bedroom with a window that caught the morning light and a small fireplace that would keep the cold out when October came, and Clara hung curtains she had made from a blue-checked cotton and set a wooden cradle beside the window that Elias had made through the long winter evenings, working with a patience and attention to craft that had produced something so well made and so beautiful that she had stood looking at it for a long time before she could trust herself to speak. "It is the finest thing I have ever seen," she told him. He said nothing, which was his version of extreme pleasure. Their son arrived on the 8th of October, 1883, in the early morning when the first light was coming gray and clear through the bedroom window, and the mountains outside were just becoming visible against the lightening sky. Clara's delivery was attended by the older miner's wife, who had become, over the months of Clara's pregnancy, something very close to a friend, and by Gideon Marsh, who sat downstairs through the whole thing with a glass of whiskey he never drank and a determination to be useful that found expression in keeping the fire going and the water hot, and the house otherwise entirely still. Elias sat outside the bedroom door for 6 hours and did not move from the chair except twice, both times to bring Clara water when she asked for it. And when the cry of the child came through the door, he put his face in his hands for a moment in the chair in the hallway, before he stood up and straightened and pushed the door open. The boy was large, as she'd expected, and dark-haired, and furiously indignant about the whole affair. And he looked, Clara thought, exactly like his father, which was the single most satisfying thing she had experienced in a year that had contained a considerable number of satisfying things. She put him in Elias's arms. Elias held him with the same careful certainty he brought to everything, the baby looking very small in those large scarred hands, and looked at his son in the morning light with an expression that Clara tucked away in the part of herself that kept the things too precious to leave to memory alone. They named him Thomas Garrett Cade, Thomas for her father who had taught her everything she knew, and Garrett for Elias's own father, who had died when Elias was young, and who Elias spoke of rarely, but with a quiet reverence that told you everything about how a boy became the kind of man Elias was. The following years in Harrow Creek moved with the particular satisfying weight of a life that had found its shape. Thomas, who was called Tom from the time he was old enough to have a preference in the matter, grew fast in the way that children in good mountain air grew, and by the time he was 2 years old, was navigating the front porch of Marsh's store with a determination and a complete disregard for the physics of his own balance that kept Clara in a state of perpetual low-level vigilance. He had Elias's gray eyes and Clara's dark hair, and a temperament that seemed to combine his mother's clear-eyed practicality with his father's absolute immovability in the face of anything he had decided was the truth, which was a combination that Gideon Marsh observed would either make him a great man or an extraordinary nuisance, and quite possibly both. Elias was a father in the same way he was everything else, which was to say with complete commitment and without any of the self-consciousness that some men brought to the role. He carried Tom on his shoulders through the market street on Saturday mornings with a naturalness that made women stop and stare, which Clara noticed and did not particularly mind, because she was the one who got to go home with both of them. He taught Tom the names of every peak visible from the front porch before the boy could string a full sentence together, pointing and naming in the patient, unhurried way. And by the time Tom was 3, he could identify a half-dozen mountain shapes by sight, which was either remarkable or a reflection of the single-mindedness with which both his parents approached the things they considered important. Clara's practice continued to grow, slowly and steadily in the way of things that are built on genuine need and genuine competence, rather than on the appetite of the moment. By 1885, she was seeing patients 4 days a week in the examination room above the apothecary, and Gideon Marsh had solved the practical problem of her divided time by hiring a girl named June from the family of a newly arrived farmer who was quick to learn and interested in medicine, and who Clara began teaching with the same patient thoroughness her father had used with her. The territory was changing around them. The mines that had founded Harrow Creek were deepening and expanding, drawing more families and fewer single men, and the town was developing the particular self-conscious respectability of a place that has decided to become permanent. A proper school opened in the spring of 1885, and a second church, and a newspaper that covered the news of the territory with varying degrees of accuracy, and a strong editorial opinion about the importance of law and order that Sheriff Dulles read every week and commented upon to anyone who would listen. There were still hard things. The winter of 1884 was the hardest in years, and 2 families in the outlying homesteads lost children to fever in January, and Clara rode out through the snow to both of them and came home both times too late and too silent, and Elias met her at the door and held her without asking what had happened, because some things did not require explanation, and the only useful response to them was presence. She cried, and then she slept, and then she got up in the morning and went back to work, because that was what her father had taught her and what the work demanded. But she was glad, in a way that was beyond gratitude and closer to necessity, that Elias was there. In the summer of 1885, They rode up to the cabin together with Tom in front of Elias on the gray horse and Clara on the roan, and spent 2 months in the high country while June managed the practice and Marsh managed everything else. The cabin had grown again, another room added in the spring, and it sat in the high meadow in July with the wildflowers chest-high around it and the creek running cold and clear below the lower meadow and the sky the absolute blue of high-altitude summer. And Clara thought that of all the things she had been given in her life, this particular collection of them was the most inexplicable and the most complete. She told Elias on the porch one evening, the same porch where she had stood the first time and felt the mountains settle around her like something she had been looking for, that she was pregnant again. He was not surprised this time, or if he was, he managed it faster, and what came across his face was simply and immediately joy, uncomplicated and enormous, and he reached for her with both arms, and she went to him, and he held her in the evening light above the meadow while Tom slept inside, and the mountains turned gold in the setting sun. "A girl this time, I think," she said. "I have not expressed a preference," he said, which was both true and also not the full answer, because his expression when he said it gave him away entirely. "You would like a daughter," she said. "I would like whatever is coming," he said, "because it is ours." Their daughter arrived in December of 1885, during a snowstorm that shut Harrow Creek in behind white walls and turned the world outside the window to a howling gray-white silence, which Clara observed was the appropriate weather for a child who had already demonstrated, through the course of the pregnancy, a strong and independent temperament. She was small where Tom had been large, and dark-eyed where Tom was gray-eyed, and she arrived without any of the drama of her brother's birth, efficiently and with a composure that suggested she had assessed the situation and determined the most effective approach. They named her Anna Margaret Cade, Anna for Elias's mother, and Margaret for the older miner's wife, who had attended both births and whose steady presence Clara had come to count on in ways that went well beyond the practical. Tom, when he was introduced to his sister the morning after her birth, considered her with the same grave attention he gave to things he was deciding how to categorize. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "She is small," in a tone that was either critical or impressed and was impossible to distinguish between the two. And Elias told him she would not always be small, and Tom appeared to accept this as a satisfactory answer and asked for breakfast, which was the most reasonable response in the world to a major life change, and which Clara chose to interpret as a sign that he was going to be a good brother. He was. He was, in fact, an excellent brother, with the same instinct for protection that his father demonstrated, which manifested in Tom by the age of 4 as a habit of walking between Anna and the edges of things and explaining to anyone who would listen that his sister was important, which was either charming or alarming depending on your vantage point, and was entirely accurate regardless. By 1887, Harrow Creek had a school teacher and a proper doctor who had come up from Denver and set up a practice in the building next to the apothecary. And Clara's medical work shifted from necessity to collaboration, the two of them handling the town's health needs between them, with a division of labor that worked because neither was territorial about it, and both were better at some things than the other. The doctor, a young man named Seville, who had been trained in the East and who had come West, with the particular combination of idealism and practical competence that Clara recognized as the best version of what medicine could produce, was excellent with the mine injuries and the bone work, and deferred completely to Clara on deliveries and the long-term management of families who had known her for years and trusted her in the particular way people trusted someone who had been there for their worst moments. Clara found that she was, by degrees, becoming something she had not planned on being, which was a person of standing in Harrow Creek, a woman to whom other women came not just for medicine, but for advice and steadiness and the particular quality of reassurance that came from someone who had seen things and not been destroyed by them. She found she liked it, in the careful way she liked things, acknowledging their value without letting them become the whole of what she was. She talked to Elias about this on a summer evening on the back porch of the house, which had become the place where their most important conversations happened as naturally as water finding its level. He listened in the way he always listened, completely and without interruption, and when she was done, he said, "You have always been that. The town has simply caught up." She looked at him. He looked back at her with those gray eyes that still, after 4 years of marriage, had the quality of paying a very particular attention. "You are very certain about things," she said. "About most things," he said. "About you, entirely." She leaned into him on the porch bench, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the warm summer evening and listened to the sounds of their children playing in the yard. Tom's voice and Anna's higher one, and the mountains above the town were blue and enormous in the last light, and everything that had seemed uncertain in the autumn of 1882 was now as solid as those peaks, as permanent and as dependable and as quietly magnificent. In the autumn of 1887, Elias sold 3 seasons of extraordinary furs to a merchant who had come up from Billings specifically to find the man whose reputation for bear-tooth mink and beaver had preceded him to the city. And with the proceeds of that sale, and the money Clara had saved from her practice, and the not inconsiderable contribution of Gideon Marsh, who claimed he was investing and not giving gifts, which was not convincing to anyone, but which they allowed him, they bought the land at the edge of town, where the property met the first rise of the foothills. The house they built there over the following summer was the house they had meant to build since they married, a proper house with 4 rooms and a wide front porch and a back porch and a kitchen large enough to be used for the medical consultations Clara had increasingly conducted at the kitchen table, because the examination room was for procedures, and the kitchen table was for the kind of talk that required warmth and a cup of tea. They built it themselves, largely, with help from men in the town who came on weekends, because Elias Cade had helped enough people with enough things that when he was building something, the town considered the return of assistance its own obligation. Clara planted a kitchen garden, and Elias built a fence around it, and Tom helped with both, and Anna supervised from the fence rail with the particular imperious interest of a 3-year-old. And on the first night they slept in the new house. Clara lay awake in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, and the sound of Elias breathing beside her, and the children sleeping in the room across the hall. And she thought about the woman she had been in the autumn of 1882 with her battered satchel and her expectations of very little. She thought about a coal bucket in an alley and a gunshot and steady hands, and a man who had put himself between her and the bullet because he knew enough. She thought about lamplight and whiskey and a needle and thread and tears she had not been able to stop. She thought about a letter from the mountains in February written in a large, direct hand. She thought about a rocky outcropping above a mountain waterfall and a hand finding hers on the warm stone. Elias stirred beside her, and she felt him come awake in the particular slow way he did, attentive before he was fully conscious. "Can you not sleep?" he asked, his voice low and sleep-rough. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the alley," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he shifted, and she felt his arm come around her in the dark, pulling her toward him with the careful certainty of a man who has been doing this for 4 years and intends to go on doing it indefinitely. "I would do it again," he said. "I know," she said. "I would stitch you again." "I know," he said. She pressed her face against his chest, against the place where the scar was, the small raised seam of her own work beneath his shirt, which she touched sometimes when he was sleeping in the particular way she touched the things she was most grateful for. "Elias," she said. "Clara," he said. "I love you," she said. "I have never been so glad of anything in my life as I am of you." He held her tighter in the dark, and she felt the slow, steady beat of his heart against her face. "The feeling," he said, in that low, quiet voice that still carried her name through it like a thread through cloth, "is exact and complete." Outside, the September wind moved through the pines at the base of the foothills, and the stars were out over the Beartooth Range, a mountain sky in the Montana dark, brilliant and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small warm house below it, where 2 children slept and their parents lay in the dark, saying the things that mattered. In the spring of 1889, Montana was admitted to the Union as the 41st state, and Harrow Creek celebrated with a dinner on the main street and a great deal of noise that Tom, at 5 years old, participated in with an enthusiasm that required Clara and Elias to alternate in chasing him between the tables and the horses, while Anna rode on Elias's shoulders and grabbed handfuls of his hair, which she had been doing since she was old enough to reach it, and which he permitted with a long-suffering patience that fooled no one about how much he enjoyed it. The school that had opened in 1885 now had 37 students and 2 teachers, and Tom started in the fall of 1889 with the solemnity of someone undertaking a serious professional commitment rather than the first grade, which was consistent with his general approach to things but still produced a laugh from Clara that she turned into a cough before he could take offense. He read by the end of October with the focused determination he brought to everything, and Clara brought him medical books in the evenings that she had thought were too advanced and found, repeatedly, that they were not. June, the girl Clara had hired as her assistant years ago, had by now trained sufficiently to handle the routine practice on her own and had begun to speak about going east to a proper medical school, which Clara encouraged with every resource at her disposal and the particular ferocity of a woman who had had to learn everything through informal channels and was not going to allow the same limitation on someone in her charge if she could help it. She wrote letters to the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which had been admitting women since 1850, and had graduated women doctors for decades, and she collected references from Dr. Seville and Gideon Marsh and the circuit judge, who still remembered the Harlan case with admiring clarity. And she put the whole packet in June's hands in the spring of 1890 with the instruction to write to them and not stop writing. June went to Philadelphia in the fall of 1891, and Clara threw a party for her in the new house kitchen that was attended by half the town. And Gideon Marsh, in a good coat he had been keeping for occasions of precisely this sort, and when June left on the eastbound stage, Clara stood on the road and watched the stage out of sight, and came home and told Elias she was very happy about it, and then cried about it for 20 minutes, which were not contradictory things. Gideon Marsh, at 63, sold the general store in 1890 to a young couple who had come up from Wyoming and who maintained the same excellent standards of inventory and an even better kitchen, which was the highest possible standard by which he could have been judged. He moved into the small house behind the store permanently and became, in the most natural way possible, a fixture in Clara and Elias's house, appearing for Sunday suppers with the consistency of weather and spoiling Anna with a thoroughness that Clara objected to in principle and permitted in practice, because the expression on Marsh's face when Anna ran to him at the door was something she had no interest in preventing. Tom, who was 8 by the time the store changed hands, had by then already begun accompanying Elias on the shorter mountain trips, riding the gray horse which had been replaced the previous year by a younger gray horse of similar temperament and remarkable stamina that Tom had named, with characteristic practicality, Gray. He learned from Elias the things the mountains required, how to read weather coming off the high peaks, how to build a fire in wet conditions, how to navigate by the angle of the light and the shape of the terrain. He learned them with the same focused attention he brought to the medical books and the school lessons, absorbing them into himself in the way that some people absorb the things that are native to them. Clara watched Elias teach their son with a feeling that she had no exact word for, only the knowledge that it was large and warm and permanent. She watched the way Elias was with Tom, the patience and the high expectations and the absolute consistency that was, she understood, the most important thing a person could give a child, the absolute confidence that the ground beneath them would not move. Anna, for her part, learned to read at 4½ by the simple expedient of refusing to wait for the school to teach her, sitting in Clara's lap at the kitchen table every evening until she could do it herself, which took 3 months and resulted in a 5-year-old who held books up in front of her face with a proprietary satisfaction that was almost comic and entirely irresistible. She had Clara's precision and Elias's directness, and a stubbornness that exceeded both of them, which Elias observed would serve her well or serve everyone else very poorly, and quite possibly both simultaneously, which was the longest sentence he had directed toward any subject in months, and which Clara took as evidence of the depth of his appreciation. By 1892, they had lived in Harrow Creek for 10 years, which felt both impossibly short and entirely complete, like a sentence that has found its period. Clara was 34, and Elias was 40, and the life they had built together had the density of something that had been accumulating through careful and deliberate living, the way good soil accumulates, layer by layer, until it can grow anything. There were, in the autumn of that year, Two things that happened that mattered. The first was that Elias received word through a fur merchant in Billings that a cousin of his, a man he had not seen since boyhood, was coming west from Ohio with his family and was looking for land in the Montana Territory. And Elias wrote back to him and told him about the land along the eastern slope of the foothills, where the soil was deep and the water was reliable. And the cousin, a man named James Cade, arrived in Harrow Creek in October with his wife and 3 children, and was met on the main road by Elias and Tom and Anna, who regarded the arrival of cousins with the particular excitement of children who have not had them before, and find the whole concept of unexpected family extremely satisfactory. The second thing was a letter that arrived from Philadelphia from June, who had graduated from the Woman's Medical College in June of that year and had been offered a position in a hospital there that she was considering, but had written to ask whether Clara would think her foolish for wanting to come back to Harrow Creek instead. Clara wrote back the same day. She told June that she would not think her foolish. She told her that Harrow Creek had grown enough to support 2 doctors with genuine need, rather than overlap, and that if June came back, there was a room in the new house where she could stay until she found her own arrangements, and that she had kept the examination room above the apothecary in good order all this time, and it would be ready when June was ready. She did not say, though she thought it, that she had missed June with the particular ache of a teacher who has given something of herself to a student and then watched the student go, and that having her come back would feel like the closing of a circle that had been waiting these 3 years to be completed. June came back in the spring of 1893 and was installed in the examination room with all the ceremony that Harrow Creek's medical community, which was to say Clara and Dr. Seville, could provide, and she arrived as a fully trained physician and immediately demonstrated in the first week that she had spent her years in Philadelphia becoming something excellent, which was exactly what Clara had known would happen and was no less satisfying for having been predicted. On the evening of the day June took her first independent patients in the examination room, Clara came home to the house on the edge of town, where the evening light was coming warm and long through the kitchen windows, and Elias was at the stove making the elk stew he had been making since before she had known what he was to her. And Tom was at the kitchen table with a book, and Anna was on the front porch talking to the cousin's youngest, a girl her own age named Ruth, who had become in 6 months the closest thing to a sister Anna would ever have. And Gideon Marsh was in the chair by the window with a cup of coffee, which was where he was on most evenings, because home had become something they had made among themselves rather than a place any single one of them had owned exclusively. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and watched all of it. She watched her husband at the stove with the firelight on his face and his big hands moving with their particular careful efficiency. She watched her son at the table with his serious eyes and the way he held a book like it was telling him something urgent. She listened to Anna's voice from the porch, clear and confident and entirely her own. Elias turned from the stove and saw her in the doorway and looked at her with those gray eyes that still had, all these years later, the quality of paying a very particular attention. "Long day?" he asked. "Good day," she said. He held out his hand. She crossed the kitchen and took it, and he pulled her close and pressed a kiss to her temple, and she smelled the pine resin and the wood smoke, and the particular warmth that was entirely and always him, and she put her hand against his chest, against the scar she had made with her needle and thread in the back room of Marsh's store on a cold November night in 1882, and she felt his heart beating steady beneath her palm. 10 years. A bullet and a needle and a letter in February and spring coming to the mountains, and a man on a gray horse asking with absolute conviction whether she would have him. All of it had led here, to this kitchen, to this heartbeat under her hand. "The stew is going to burn," she said against his shoulder. "It will not burn," he said with the confidence of a man who knows his own stew. It did not burn. They ate together, all of them, with the windows open to the September evening and the mountains visible above the roofline in the last light, and the conversation moved around the table with the easy, particular warmth of people who have been feeding each other for long enough that the food and the talk have become the same thing, equally necessary and equally sustaining. After supper, while the children were settled and Marsh had gone back to his small house with the particular contentment of a man who has spent his evening exactly as he wished, Clara and Elias sat on the back porch in the warm dark and listened to the creek and the pines and the quiet mountain night coming down over everything. "I have been thinking," Elias said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the mountains, the way he always was when he was about to say something that mattered. "About what?" she said. "About next summer," he said. "Tom is old enough for the high country, a proper trip, all of us." She looked at him. "All of us. All of us," he said. "The cabin. A full month. Before Anna starts at the school with him." She thought about the high meadow and the wildflowers and the way the creek sounded below the lower meadow and the view from the porch that extended to what looked like the edge of the world. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I want that." He turned from the mountains and looked at her, and the moon was rising above the Beartooth Range, and the light of it was silver and clean on the high slopes. "I want you to see it in summer," he said, "with all of us there. The way it is when it is exactly what it was always supposed to be." She reached for his hand in the dark and held it. His fingers closed around hers in the steady, particular way they had always done, without ceremony and without equivocation. "I already know what that looks like," she said. He looked at her. "It looks like this," she said. The mountains were enormous and silent and permanent above them, and the stars were coming out in their thousands over the high peaks, and the creek was running cold and clear in the dark below town, and Clara Whitmore Cade sat on her own back porch in her own life, with her husband's hand in hers, and felt, as she had been learning to feel for 10 years now, the precise and unreasonable fullness of a life that had become exactly what it was always supposed to be. The summer trip happened the following year, as Elias had promised, and it was everything the high meadow offered to those willing to climb to it. Tom learning the names of every peak from his father on the first morning, while Anna filled her apron pockets with wildflowers, and Clara sat on the porch in the warm morning air, writing in the journal she had kept since Missouri, adding new pages to a life that kept insisting on exceeding the space she had made for it. They stayed 5 weeks instead of 4 because none of them could think of a good reason to leave early. And on the last morning before they rode back down, Elias stood on the porch with Clara and looked at everything they had built together, spread out below them and above them and all around them, and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required, and they were both people who understood the difference between the silence that means something is missing and the silence that means everything is present. Everything was present. Everything had always been moving since that November night in the alley toward exactly this. The bullet had found him, and her hands had found the wound, and her tears had fallen on his chest, and he had put his hand on her head in the lamplight. And all of it, every stitch and every scar and every mile between the valley and the high country, had been the same story being told from the beginning, the story of two people who were made for the particular shape of each other's lives, mountain and healer, scar and steady hands, and the long good years that came after the night when he took the bullet meant for her, and she wept over the work of bringing him back.